This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Getting today's show started is Todd Barrows, Kansas Farm Service Agency Chief Program Specialist, as he discusses programs that he has been getting questions about. Anthony Zukoff, K-State Extension entomologist, continues the show as he talks about white grubs and the impact they are having in Brome Fields in Kansas. Anthony explains why this pest is not a concern every year. Part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, Dustin Pendell, and Jason Warner completes today's show as the group converse about decreasing cost on cattle operations. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with an update from the Farm Service Agency. And today we're joined by the Kansas Farm Service Agency Chief Program Specialist, Todd Barrows. Todd, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Appreciate the invite to come over. It's always fun to talk to you, Shelby, and the listeners out there and just share some of the information that's going on in our field offices across the state. And a couple of those things that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about this visit today, I was thinking about, well, we probably ought to cover some on the livestock disaster programs and grazing losses as far as LFP. Do want to bring up water transportation for livestock, and then also gotten some questions about ARC PLC payments, crop disaster program availability, and then also upcoming reporting of spring planted crop acres.
Answering hopefully a lot of those questions that producers then might be having about those programs. And first, touching on livestock programs and the livestock forage program and water transportation program.
Absolutely. And that's the whole goal, is to sit down and just visit about and try to spur thought. And so always encouraging producers, we can't cover all the details here, and to be sure and reach out to their local service centers there to get all of the specifics. But the two programs in livestock that I really wanted to touch on, which are the livestock forage program and you mentioned water transportation program, both of those are based on the U.S. Drought Monitor. And we realize that grazing conditions will remain dry across the vast majority of Kansas, which is impacting our livestock and cattle industry and those producers that are all important to us. As our cattle ranchers are starting to turn cattle out on those grazing acres this spring, with the dry conditions not only affecting the grazing and stocking rates, but it also affects the water availability for those livestock. And so with that, I did specifically want to mention the water transportation program because I would encourage producers to keep records for their water hauling, both the miles of transportation and the gallons hauled, for the simple reason, if your physical location county does not experience or is not currently in a drought intensity of D2 for 8 consecutive weeks or higher, but it would happen to become eligible down the road, you can collect assistance under that ELAP water hauling, water transportation program retroactive back to the first week of that 8-week period. So it's important that producers keep those records current just in case of that possibility. We understand water transportation is a big issue for many of our producers because, quite honestly, we haven't received substantial rainfall or moisture over the winter that's recharged a lot of those stock water ponds and other water resources.
And as we are talking about how it needs to be at a D2 for the drought intensity, not something we're seeing right now in Kansas.
That's right. We have no eligibility as of the drought monitor comes out on Tuesday, so last drought monitor was April 9th. At that point in time, we had no one eligible at this point. But we do have a couple of small areas that are in a D2, but not for the 8 consecutive week period. The majority of the state is either in a DO or a D1.
And with that water transportation program, important to document everything, and also important to document if a wildfire unfortunately occurs near you.
Yeah, Shelby, all too often we're hearing reports and wildfires across our state. And I know we've had several that have impacted producers over the last couple of weeks. And so as I was driving over here today, I thought about that and the most important thing I want to tell producers is if you are impacted by a wildfire on your grazing acres, document. And what I mean by that is if you have unfortunately lost livestock or building structure or fencing structures because of wildfires, make sure you're documenting with pictures of that loss so that we can make sure to get you benefits to help in that recovery process, kind of when the smoke settles and ash settles and that goes forward. But be sure and get those pictures, document those losses so that we can get the needed assistance to you.
Another program then that you've been receiving quite a few questions about, ARC and PLC programs, and specifically looking at 2023 program payments.
Yeah, we've had several producers in the last couple of weeks call and inquire about the 2023 ARC PLC program and when those payments will be coming out and if we had any indication on what they will be. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to come back and just reiterate for some of those newer producers that maybe not as experienced to understand the process on how the payments are calculated. And the main thing is, there's multiple factors that go into that payment process. But keep in mind, one of the big ones is weighted average yearly market price. So for your fall planted commodities such as wheat, barley, oats, that pricing year for that marketing year average price doesn't start calculation until June 1 and goes through to the following May. For spring planted program crops like your corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans, that marketing year starts in September 1. So basically, again, after harvest and then runs through August 31st. And that would be of 2024 since we're talking about 2023. With that being said, the point is it's too early for us now to really have a prediction. And we won't know what those weighted prices come out until closer till September 1 or end of September when that marketing year ends and we can do the calculations.
As we are talking about payments then, have you heard anything on the 2023 disaster program for crops?
Again, unfortunately, nothing's currently been talked about. We do know there was quite a little bit of crop loss due to the extent of the drought last year in 2023. That would be something that would be a statutory issue where it would take funding from Congress. But at this time, I do want to remind producers that even though there's nothing currently on the books for 2023 crop loss, we are still in the enrollment process for calendar year 2022 crop losses under the ERP2 program. And those are due to weather-related events, and there has not been a deadline date yet established or announced for the ending of that program. While we realize many producers in Kansas do participate with crop insurance, and so they have already collected benefits through the ERP2 program, Track 1, which is for crop insurance producers. I want to remind producers who may not have suffered a loss of great enough to trigger an indemnity through their crop insurance or may have not have purchased crop insurance, they can still file for a revenue loss under the ERP2 program, and it's specifically called ERP2 Track 2. And what Track 2 does is compares your disaster year revenue, in this case 2022, with your benchmark year revenue, and that would be the producer's choice, either 2018 or 2019 tax year.
Todd, as we are talking about all these different payments, just a reminder that the way the producers will be receiving those payments has changed a little bit.
Yeah, over the last several years, the government has made a big push as not only a cost saver, but a way to get payments to the producers quicker and easier, and that is through direct deposit. So if you haven't already signed up for direct deposit, which I realize many of you have, thank you for doing that. But those that have not, we really would encourage and hope that you would consider sign up for direct deposit of those payments. It's not only faster to get the money into your bank account, but it's also a cheaper way of processing and more efficiently using your tax dollars, putting those to work for us.
And Todd, talking about crops and everything taking place right now, and one of those things is a lot of producers are getting in their field with their planter, and anything that just need to remind them about.
Just the best time to report acreage is as soon as you are done planting. Just a reminder, as well as reporting those acres planted to not only FSA, but your crop insurance agent, you will need to also report, planting date by field, your cropping practice, whether it's irrigated dry land, your type of crop, and then also your harvest intention, whether you're going to harvest that for grain, forage hay, graze it, or, et cetera, whatever that case might be. While crop reporting deadline is not till July 15th, reporting as soon as you are finished planting ensures FSA has ample time to record your report and also, more importantly, maintaining your eligibility for many program benefits that help you survive out there and producing the bread and the food for our nation and our country.
If people have more questions about these programs or other programs, where can they find out more information?
Two things. They can always reach out to our local service centers for more detailed information. And the other great resource is through Farmers.gov on the internet. They have done a great overhaul of that website in the last year. User-friendly and a lot of fact sheets, a lot of program information. So again, that's Farmers.gov on the internet.
Todd, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and answer some questions that you've been receiving from our farmers.
Thank you, Shelby. It's always fun to come over and visit with you and visit with the producers out there. And like I said, hopefully we may not have answered all your questions today, but at least spur some thought. And then your more detailed questions, be sure to reach out to your local service centers.
Absolutely. That was the Kansas Farm Service Agency Chief Program Specialist, Todd Barrows. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show talking about white grubs in Brome. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Extension entomologist in Garden City, Anthony Zukoff. Anthony, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Anthony, as we begin talking about white grubs, can you first give us some background knowledge about them?
So white grubs, we hear people talk about white grubs. What is that? So when people refer to a white grub, they're referring to the larval stage of many different species of beetle that are very common, and people tend to refer to them as June bugs or May beetles. So just a very common scarab beetle. There's a lot of different species, but all of the white grubs are called white grubs because they are going to be a very white ivory color when you dig them, you find them in the soil. They'll be bright white with a brownish or dark head. And characteristically, when you disturb them in the soil, you'll see them kind of curl up into a C shape. So very easy to identify this particular below-ground pest. It's a white grub that curls into a C when you find it.
And what is the life cycle of a white grub?
That's a good question. So we have white grub species that are considered annual species, and so that means they develop from egg to adult in the same season, right? So you get a new flush of beetles every year. But then we have species that are considered perennial, and they take 3 years. Their life cycle is 3 years long in the soil, and so they take 3 years to develop, and they impact a location or a crop over a period of 4 calendar years. So they develop a lot slower, and these perennial, so to speak, white grubs are the ones that tend to be the biggest problem.
And what problem can these white grubs be?
So they're like I said, a below-ground pest, and what they're doing, they're seeking out root systems of a huge number of plants. They're very generalist pests. They're found in Brome Fields, like we're discussing today. They're found in all kinds of row crops. They're in the wild. They're eating root systems of all kinds. And so they're developing in the soil and consuming roots, and that's how they live. So they damaging the root system, they're going to stop the plants from taking up moisture well, stop the plants from taking up nutrients really well, and just basically really damage the plant, if not kill it outright.
And you mentioned in the soil, so is this something you would ever see above the soil or always down with the roots?
In this particular pest, being a below-ground pest, in the larval stage, that's the only time it's a pest. You'd see it above ground once it becomes an adult beetle. So all those beetles that flock to your porch lights at night and get in your windowsills and become a nuisance, that's the extent of that once they're out of the ground.
And really, what damage are you seeing on Brome Fields this year?
What people are seeing is large areas of Brome Fields just dying. So there's dead spots. And depending on the field, it's quite variable. There's some fields that maybe 10% of the field is dead. But in extreme case, there's 75 to 80% of the field was killed by below ground white grub activity. Once the folks are out there digging around trying to see why this field was dead, they started to find white grubs really easily in the soil. And that's pretty good indication that it's white grubs that are causing the damage in these fields.
So if producers are seeing dead spots, it might be worth going and digging up a few plants?
Certainly, that's very important because, the folks found these grubs because they're going to take soil samples and see if they're nutrient deficient or something like that, and they started finding the grubs. But if you suspect you have grub problems, go to these dead spots, and especially the edges of the dead spots in the living grass, because they'll be transition. They're not going to hang out in the dead spot forever. They're going to go find more roots. So dig in those transition zones and see what you find. And scouting and determining the size of the grubs is going to be important. It's the perennial one, the 3-year life cycle species of white grub that are going to be doing the damage. And if you're digging and you're finding white grubs that are nickel size or larger, any kind of the particular insecticide application you could apply in this case won't impact really large grubs. So that would be kind of driving your management decisions. If you're digging around and most of the grubs are dime size or smaller, and I'm using coins because remember they curl up into a C, so it's really easy to kind of compare it to a circle. So if they're dime size or smaller, an insecticide application, if you choose to make one, will impact them a lot better than if they're older, larger larvae.
White grubs aren't something we talk about every year because it's not always an issue. So is this something that producers should be more worried about this year and going out and treating their fields?
I think this is a pest that folks should just, occasionally remind themselves of because, again, having such a long life cycle, it's not going to be a problem every single year, but under the right conditions like this year, it kind of caught people off guard in this Brome Field setting. When we're dealing with row crops and we're rotating different crops and disturbing the soil every year, they don't tend to become such a big problem. But in a perennial type cropping system, their levels can build up really easily. And, large populations of white grubs coupled with things like drought stress and stuff can really drive these losses that they're seeing in the Brome Fields.
What are those preferred conditions for white grub?
Well, they like moist soil for sure. They don't tend to be a problem in very arid or semi-arid areas unless they're in an irrigated setting. So moist soil, scenarios where you have constant root presence, so a perennial Brome Field, they have a constant food source every year. There's no break in that. Like if you fallow a field, these beetles won't have anything to eat and the larva will die. So, they have to have a constant food source, moisture, and that really helps them succeed.
You mentioned that producers have found this in their field this year. And is this something that all of Kansas should be worried about or just select parts?
I would say in this particular scenario with the Brome situation, I'd say in eastern Kansas, folks should pay attention to what they're seeing in their fields. If they're seeing dead spots, even if it's very small, get out there and just see. Because given the life cycle with these grubs, the first year, so in the spring, adults will go to a field and they'll lay eggs. And that very first season, the eggs hatch and the white grubs are very small and they feed on the root systems, but they don't do a lot of damage because they're small. At the end of that season, they migrate down in the soil profile to overwinter. And by the time they do that at the end of the season, they've gotten a little bit bigger and into what we call a second instar. And then the next spring, they'll migrate back up into the soil profile, into that root zone. And the second season, when they're bigger and they're really hungry and developing to that final stage, that's when they do a lot of their damage. So the very first year, if you have a big influx of beetles laying eggs in your field, you don't know about it because the damage is small. And what we're seeing right now is probably the second year of a very large egg-laying event, basically, in these Brome Fields by beetles. And they're doing a lot of their damage now because they're just bigger and they're trying to complete their life cycles. And so at the end of this season, those larvae that are doing all the damage now will go back down into the soil profile and overwinter. And then next year, they will rise again to continue eating the brome roots, but they won't do as much damage because they're basically finishing up their development. And then they'll kind of go dormant and emerge the next year as adult beetles. So again, it's a 3-year life cycle, but it impacts the field for 4 calendar years. And so it's basically the second into the third year where you're going to see damage like this that we're seeing in the Brome Fields.
So if producers are just seeing a little bit of damage, maybe just hold off because it shouldn't be a problem for next year.
Maybe so, but I would be at least they need to be aware of it, that they might have white grubs. And, depending, so we were talking about the wide variability of damaged fields. We have some fields where it's just kind of spots that are noticeable. We have fields that are almost wiped out. In situations where the damage is more limited, someone might make the decision to replant brome into those dead spots. But what they'd want to do is make sure they get into those dead spots, maybe cultivate a little bit to clear the ground and replant in the fall the brome. Because if you establish it in the fall, once it gets to spring, the root system will be bigger and deal with that spring feeding damage. Because in the fall, the beetles aren't going to be feeding on that new root system. So that's something to consider. And before replanting, if that's what they want to do, they probably should consider going into those dead areas, and especially the transition areas around those dead areas, and treating the ground with carbaryl, commonly known as 7. And if they do choose to use that insecticide, they want to make sure that they're going to put it on with a large volume of water to get that insecticide down into the soil where the grubs will come in contact with it. If they just spray it on top of the ground, or if they spray it on the ground, they haven't cleared the vegetation, that insecticide is not going to get into the soil, into the zone where the grubs are active.
Anthony, as we have focused today's conversation on brome, wanting to quickly mention that these white grubs can impact more than just brome.
Yeah, they're a pest of not just brome. They're a pest of pretty much any row crop. They're generalists. They just want to feed on root systems. So in row crop scenarios, people use insecticidal seed treatments to prevent damage from this pest. And getting back to the different scale of damage in fields that are very, very dead, the brome fields this season, there's been some questions about just planting to a crop. So one producer is asking about planting that field into soybean. And that is an option, but what you want to do if you're going to replant to something is make sure you kill off all the brome in that field or any other vegetation that might be there. Kill off all the brome in the field and make sure it's dead for 2 to 4 weeks, because what you're doing is basically starving out those larvae that are in the field. And then when you do replant to soybean, for example, make sure you use an insecticidal seed treatment. And depending on how bad the population was, you might even consider doing an at-plant insecticide into the furrow to deal with some, residual white grub action.
If people have any questions about this, how could they find out more information?
Certainly, you can visit the Entomology Department website, where there's information on all different row crops and pastures and brome pest control, or you can reach out to me directly via email or telephone here at Garden City.
Anthony, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was K-State Extension entomologist in Garden City, Anthony Zukoff, talking about white grubs. I will link his information in today's show notes, as well as the Entomology website, if you'd like to find out more information. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with another portion of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. This week we're joined by Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, Bob Larson, Jason Warner, and Dustin Pendell.
This question that I want to pose to each of you: how do I decrease costs on my operation without decreasing performance?
Well, I'm going to lead with one of the things is, first of all, you kind of need to know what level of performance you are. And what's important to me a lot of times is the breed up, the pregnancy percentage, particularly the pregnancy percentage early in the breeding season. And if that is below really what the target should be for your geographic area, then I think making sure that you reach the level of production that you need, and basically calves weaned per cow exposed. And, I think in central Kansas, you ought to be getting a preg percentage of between 90 and 95%. And that ought to be doable. That's not necessarily doable in all geographic areas, but with our forage base, and we've got a lot of ranches that can accomplish that without getting crazily high with the costs. So you need some base level of production. Costs become really important.
I'm going to follow up on that. You need the base level production, but you also need to track, and you got to know what your costs are. So you need to record that, because it's hard to lower costs if you don't know what your costs are. And I think when you think about the cost, if you look at, let's say the Kansas Farm Management data set, feed costs are one of your largest expenses. And so from there, I even break that down into maybe purchased feed versus homegrown feed, versus pasture expenses. And so each one of those, I think you can think through, is there a way I can possibly decrease those costs? And so we'll just take grazing as an example. Do you have a grazing management plan? That would be one step. And then if so, how often do you update it? Do you soil test? Do you need to put on various fertilizers, et cetera? What's your stocking rates? So I think those are all the things, like you just pick a category and just think through all the various components of each one.
To both of your points, one thing that I really think of when I think about just decreasing costs when it comes to feed costs, as you mentioned, that's a real high percentage of the overall total cost of the operation. But doing things like managing shrink, so when you get into those feeding situations, regardless of whether it's for calves or for cows, managing shrink and just measuring that and putting a dollar figure to that is important. Feed costs are $1.50 a cow a day, 10%, 15 cents. That adds up over time, right?
So when you talk about shrink, maybe say a little bit more. What do you mean?
It can be feed shrink in terms of harvested forages, even commodities that you might purchase, how you manage and store those, additional costs that you might have if you overfeed on certain loads, spilling ingredients, those types of things. A lot of those fundamental things there are sources where costs can come in that you may not see.
And often it's hidden, but basically shrink is the difference between what I bought and what I used or sold.
Right, exactly. Yep.
I think I'm going to disagree with Bob a little bit, and I think maximum performance is not necessarily the goal. I mean, we think about reproduction. There's a certain percentage of cows that will get bred, at body condition score 4.5, rather than 5. And so the problem is I don't know which individual cows those are, so I feed the whole herd. So I think there's a plan, or needs to be a plan, or think through the process of what is my cost per unit of whatever output. And it may not be maximal performance. It may be 85 to 90% pregnancy rates. It may be depending on where I'm at and what my feed costs are, and to do that. So I need to think more about, I have to meet a certain level of performance. No, I need to minimize the cost per unit of whatever output.
Just unit cost of production. Yep, absolutely.
Which really comes back to knowing what's my performance, what's my dollars in, and what are my dollars out, and figuring out where the low-hanging fruit is. Is it to increase performance, or is it to decrease cost, or is it a little bit of both? That maybe I can get by with less performance and even greater less cost. And really, but you got to have some records to do that. And that's why I'm looking at Dustin. That's what he would say.
Well, and that's what when you've looked at that Kansas farm management data, Dustin, that's what you've seen is there's not huge differences on some of the performance side, but there are differences on the cost side.
And that's where most of it is. It comes back to the cost side between your high performers and your low performers.
Absolutely. Well, appreciate you guys' thoughts on that.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.